Okay, so today we'll be looking at the reign of sin, the time period after the fall, after Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden. And the next great turning point we have to look at after the fall, any guesses? Cain and Abel could be considered a turning point, probably not a major turning point in world history, but a lot of things about this time period, a lot of the effects of the fall that might not have been immediately obvious came out through that incident. Yeah, very good. All right, so the flood marked a very dramatic turning point in the way that God dealt with the earth and with humanity. And so the time between the fall and the flood is going to be our focus today. What was distinctive about that time period? Everyone doing what was right in his own eyes was the book of Judges, the time of Israel when they didn't have a king. But this is the time period of which it was said every inclination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil all the time, when it talks about the human race. So this is often referred to as the age of conscience. For those of people who like to classify the different time periods of history, the way God has dealt with people, we have the age of innocence, and then afterwards we have the age of conscience, where people were meant to be governed by the knowledge of good and evil that they had received. They knew good, they knew evil, they could tell the difference for themselves without God's help. And God held them accountable for that. Does someone have 2 Peter 3:3-7?
We must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, "Where is this coming from? Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation." But they deliberately forgot that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed of water by water. By these waters also the growth of their time was renewed and by the same
So we have a parallel between that time and this time, don't we? The world at that time was being reserved for judgment. It had the mechanism of its destruction built into it. The waters of the deep burst forth when the flood occurred. Those who hold to the canopy theory, that the climate was certainly different back then, and we don't have a full picture of what that was like. But the enormous amount of rain and then the water from the ground as well, those were things built into creation from the beginning. God always knew that this was going to happen. And those who acted as if God's judgment was never going to come were proven to be sadly mistaken. And in that passage, it says the world at that time, like a different world than we have now. Human civilization ended with the flood and had to restart almost from scratch. And it's a mind-boggling thought if you really think about it. We're used to God changing things in history, guiding history, but to have him cut it short the way that he did and start over. is something he has only done once and actually promised will never do again. But the flood was a very significant event. The geography of the world changed, of course. Barriers like oceans and mountain ranges separate people now to an extent that they probably did not before the flood. So groups of people are more isolated. Groups of animals are more isolated. You have animals, a lot of them that you only find in Australia and nowhere else, for example. We went from one world to a set of smaller worlds in a way. And because life itself was cut short from where it was, genetic variety became much more limited. Biologically, there are very significant results from the flood. It's not just people who started living shorter lifespans. We went to the zoo a little while ago and Binder Park, and right in there with the dinosaurs was this enormous snake, this python basically, and they had a prehistoric snakish name for it and had a little picture of it fighting a triceratops, but it was just a huge snake. Same as we would have today, but bigger. There were a lot of animals that, of course, went extinct, dinosaurs included. And larger varieties, sometimes it seems better varieties of the animals that we see today, were lost. And humanity itself, the genetic variety was probably, it had to have been broader before the flood than we have now, with just a small number of people surviving. The flood was more than just a geological event. It was more than just a biological event, though. It was, as I said, a major turning point in the way God dealt with mankind. And we'll be looking later at some of the things that changed, not only on the earth, but in how God interacts with his creation. All right, so let's start at the beginning of this time period. The most major thing that happens during this time period that we have the most detail on is, of course, Cain and Abel, and it happens right at the beginning of this time period, but it can show us a lot of how God dealt with humanity. Genesis 4, starting in verse 1, says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again she gave birth to his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground, or a cultivator of the ground." Remember the significance of the ground that we saw last week. Adam came from the ground. He brought life out of the ground through cultivation. Cain has the same profession as his father here. He's also a farmer. And so it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." So how are these two different sacrifices described, and what is the reason given for the rejection of Cain's sacrifice? It's very possible. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. The big difference we noticed between the two sacrifices is that Cain's was from the ground, and the work of his hands, and then Abel's was a blood sacrifice. It involved the death of an animal. And it's very, very possible that God had commanded them to bring that sort of sacrifice. It doesn't say that explicitly, but it's a very easy connection to make. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So it might have something to do with Cain's pride here, wanting to bring something that he had made himself, not something that he had to go to Abel for. Yeah. Right. There's another little comment in there that Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. So it says specifically that he brought the best, the first of what he had. It does not say that about Cain. It doesn't say he didn't, but it doesn't say he did. So there's that emphasis as well. But it is very clear that Cain knew better. God said, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? Will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. So whether this was a command that God gave them or not, or something that he knew that they should have known already, it's very possible that Cain was not accepted simply because his lifestyle was wrong, because he did evil in other areas, which he almost certainly did. But God is demanding of Cain a certain standard and expecting him to know the difference between what is good and what is not. Cain told Abel his brother in verse 8, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? God said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. So there doesn't seem to be, just a side note, a full awareness of all of the attributes of God, of exactly who God is, of his omnipresence. We see that God comes to them and speaks to them, but with both Adam and Eve in the garden when they hid, and Cain trying to pull the wool over God's eyes in this passage, it doesn't seem like they had a full grasp of God as someone who knew everything and who was everywhere. But the significant thing here is that what has Cain done to the ground? He defiled it. Right. He has sown something in the ground that does not belong there. And he has defiled the ground that he worked with, that he came from himself. The ground is very significant, again, in these first few chapters of Genesis. And God says, now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. He told Adam, the ground is cursed because of you. He told Cain, you are cursed from the ground. Verse 12, when you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden. And I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." So the Lord said to him, whoever kills Cain, therefore, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So Cain says that his punishment is too great for him to bear. Does it seem that way to us? What strikes us as odd in this passage about God's judgment on Cain? What would we expect to happen today? Right. Why wasn't Cain killed? Cain said, "Anyone who finds me will kill me." He had a sense that that is what he deserved. So why didn't Cain die because of this? God's mercy, right? To Cain it felt harsh, but God was being very merciful here. He was giving Cain less than he deserved. There was still a consequence, but at this period of time, it does not seem that God condoned violence against human beings for any reason before the flood. And you can tell as you read through, as you look at the example of Lamech, in just a little bit further down the passage, Lamech was the first person to have two wives. He invented the practice of polygamy. But he said to his wives in verse 23, "Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold." God told Cain that if anyone killed him, he would be avenged sevenfold. Lamech says, "I wasn't killed, I was just struck, I was just wounded, and I retaliated by killing the one who struck me." And he boasts of this. And I see a parallel here. He is avenged 77-fold. Christ said we are to forgive 77 times, or 70 times 7 times. The opposite kind of mindset. Lamech? Only one that we know of. Oh, yeah. Just because of he's speaking in poetry, which you can tell. Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech. So he's saying the exact same thing twice in different words, which is typically how Hebrew poetry works. So it's possible he killed two people. But just following the form of the poetry, it makes it sound like one. So Lamech boasts in this. He feels like he's getting away with something. He feels like there's no consequence for his behavior. And back to what Peter said, they did not expect judgment. They felt like they were never going to experience God's punishment for what they were doing. And the major sin that we see in the days of Noah, that the world was filled with, was violence. And I can't say this for sure, but I imagine that during that time there were a lot of debates among people who did follow God. Is it ever okay to kill people? Can we kill people in self-defense? It's possible that many believed that they couldn't, which might be part of the reason why Noah was the only righteous man left on earth at the end of this time period. We don't know that for sure, but there is definitely that theme of men killing men and God restraining himself from judgment. After the death of Abel, though, at the end of the chapter, after seeing that little genealogy of Cain's people, it says, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And there are different interpretations of what that means. I wonder, from that phrase, is that the birth of what we would call religion in an organized way? People not seeing God as simply a powerful person that they needed to appease, but actually God, beginning to worship him in a structured way. It's possible, it's also possible that the name Yahweh was introduced at that time and that people began calling him by that name. So, moving ahead, we don't have a lot of details. The only interesting detail really that we have between now and the end of this time period with Noah is Enoch. Of course, Enoch walked with God and then was not because the Lord took him away. And that's all of the information we have on him. So we can't really build too much out of that, but it's similar to what God does with Noah. He takes him out of the world as a way of preserving him. He saves him from the unrighteousness of the wicked. But Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Also gives us a glimpse into the stuff that was happening during this time. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Therefore his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So there is a lot of debate about this passage and what exactly this is talking about. Who are the sons of God? And many people say that they are powerful rulers that abused their power to take anybody that they wanted to be their wives during this time, or that they are descendants of Seth who were unfaithful to God by marrying people who did not believe in God. That wouldn't, neither of those explanations would really explain the unnatural size and strength of the Nephilim that were born as a result. The ancient view that the Jews held to is that they are angels. The sons of God are angels. And angels are also called very clearly the sons of God in Job. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also was there with them. And this is the view that I feel most comfortable with, since it's the one reflected in the New Testament. Actually, would somebody like to look up 2 Peter 2 and those verses, and somebody else just Jude 6?
Angels when they sinned, they cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. And did not serve angels, but preserved Noah, a creature of righteousness, when he brought his blood upon the world of the ungodly. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment in the day of judgment.
And that's a theme we're seeing here in this time. God's judgment is restrained. He's waiting. He's giving mankind all of the chance that he is willing to give them before finally letting the hammer fall. And Jude 6. So these statements reflect what was the Jewish view, that during the time of Noah, angels acted unnaturally. We know from Jesus this is not something that angels naturally do, that they do not marry or are given in marriage. Yeah.
Well, there are two different callings of angels. First one that we read that they were cast into the pit, and they decided only different angels that left God.
Yeah, the punishment for Satan was confinement to the earth, if that's how we understand the going on your belly that the snake was cursed with. He is down here. Ultimately, he can still go to heaven, but that's not where he belongs. And eventually in Revelation we see he's going to be cast out completely. But these spirits, it says, are imprisoned for the day of judgment. And elsewhere in Peter, it talks about Christ going and preaching to the spirits who are in prison. And it does seem that for this sin specifically, this certain set of angels were confined. They are not in the world today. They are not the demons we have to do with. Yeah. They very well may have been called demons before that point, but they are in their own special class because of what they have done. So, but the way that this is phrased in Genesis is very interesting. They saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. Literally, they saw that they were good, and they took wives for themselves. They saw that they were good, and they took. The language imitates the temptation of Eve. It's like kind of a backwards situation where you have the serpent who was Satan tempting Eve. Something looked good and she took it. And now we have the daughters of men looking good to these spiritual beings and them taking them. And actually the word took does not imply force. It's the typical way you would say that somebody had married somebody else. So in verse 3, one of the biggest objections people have to these people being angels, to the sons of God being angels, is that God doesn't get angry in this passage with angels. He gets angry with mankind. He says, "My spirit will not strive with man forever," because he is also flesh. So it's implied that man is not innocent in this situation, that it's not just the angels victimizing people. And I wonder if there was an element of ritualistic witchcraft or something performed by these women seeking to attract spirits in order to have very powerful children. I wonder if that was the motivation, if it was actually something on their side. Not making the spirits innocent, of course, but God is definitely not holding them innocent. But then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, or grace in the eyes of the Lord. So because of this situation that was going on, because the wickedness of man was great, every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. They had this knowledge of good and evil, but they always went toward the evil side, every time. And we see just a little further down in verse 11, the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. The sin of Cain, that God in his mercy had left unpunished in the fullest sense, spread and continued to infect the world. And it says all flesh had corrupted their ways. This wasn't just people who were being violent. This was animals being violent as well to each other, and probably to people as well. Animals were violent because men were violent. So mankind had proven unable and unwilling to restrain their tendency toward sin. God gave us every opportunity, and he waited until there was only one righteous man left on earth before he acted. And if we can learn anything from this period of time, looking back, it is what we would be like, what society would be like without God's intervention. If he left us to ourselves, to our own consciences to guide us, without putting restraints on our sin. But finally, since we would not restrain evil, he stepped in to restrain it for us. And what are some ways that he did this? It mentions one of them actually before the flood, in the passage on the Nephilim. In verse 3, he says, "Nevertheless, his days, man's days, shall be 120 years. And this might have something to do with the time before the flood, but it's a reality that after the flood, gradually, the human lifespan was shortened to about that length, significantly less than it was before. And that does restrain evil. It restrains the amount of trouble we can get into in our lifetimes. And of course, he personally brought judgment on the earth. The death penalty, their violence caught up with them at last through the flood. And after the flood, We're familiar enough with the account. I don't think we need to read the whole thing. We don't have time to this morning. But what God told Noah after the flood is very important, not just for understanding what things were like before the flood, but for understanding why they are the way they are now. Genesis 9, verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. That seems to not have been the case before this point, which may have been another reason why the ark was possible. It may not have been a special miracle on the part of God to settle all these animals down and allow Noah to bring them onto the ark. He might have just said, Noah, go get these animals, and Noah went and got these animals and put them on the ark because they weren't afraid of people. But now they are. Into your hand, God says, they are given. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you, as I gave the green plant. So before this point, people were not allowed to eat meat, at least not officially by God. It may have been practiced, but it was not condoned by God. And why do you suppose God may have given this allowance now? I'm just speculating. I don't know what the exact reason is. But he's giving them almost an outlet for violence, an alternative to violence against human beings. He's drawing the line exactly where it needs to be drawn. He's not letting them figure out for themselves what's right and what isn't. He's telling them this right here, killing a human being is murder, killing an animal is okay. He did not give them, though, permission to eat meat with blood in it. There was still a reverence for life that they needed to show. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it, and from every man. From every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he has made man. So he is instituting the death penalty here. He's giving people permission to kill people who are murderers, and animals who are murderers, who kill people. In fact, he's commanding them to. Don't let people get away with violence. No, he's limiting, he's restricting. He's putting guards on man's natural tendencies toward violence. As for you, he says, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you, and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you. Of all that comes out of the ark, every beast of the ark, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood. Neither shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you. for all successive generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. It shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. There's a kid's Bible we have that points out the beauty of what God is saying here, that his bow, and it's the same word that you would use for a bow that you use to shoot with. He's hanging up his weapon in the sky, basically. He's not going to use this weapon anymore against the earth. Acts 15, 19 through 20. The things that happen very, very early in human history can help us understand things that happen much later. Does someone have those?
Therefore, it is my judgment, that we do not trouble those who are turning to God from the law of the Gentiles, but that we write to them that they abstain from things contaminated by idols and from fornication and from stranglers and from blood.
Thank you. So this is a very early church council called to determine whether Gentiles should be required to keep the law of Moses, right? And the answer they came to was no. That's not what the gospel is about. Gentiles do not have to become Jewish in order to become Christians. And so they sent this letter out to the Gentile churches saying, don't worry about all of this, the people who are disturbing you, telling you that you need to keep the law. Here's the stuff that you should do, though. Don't participate in idolatry. Don't commit sexual immorality. And don't eat meat with blood in it. Why those things? Why the blood specifically? Right. And that's not part of the law, right? It's mentioned in the law, but it's actually from the time of Noah. But that's part of the direction that God gave to not just Jews, but Gentiles as well. And that's why it came up in that letter. They're not saying you must keep this little part of the law, but not the rest. All right, and this stuff we've talked about before. He instituted capital punishment and gave mankind a responsibility to carry out this judgment. So the time between the fall and the flood is often referred to as the age of conscience. This time after the flood is referred to as the age of human government, where we have responsibility to restrain evil. God has given us that responsibility. And it is human government that now exercises that responsibility, that bears the sword, according to Romans, to punish evildoers. God has delegated his authority to us. And sometimes I would consider myself a dispensationalist. And dispensationalists are the ones who basically, the idea is you have to pay attention to where you are in the story. Things changed over the course of history. The church is not Israel. They are different things. But sometimes people do like to get a little bit autistic with their charts and to say, everything in this time period is exclusive to that time period, and then we move to the next one, and then we move to the next one. It is actually a little more complicated than that, because the age of conscience didn't end with the flood. We're still in the age of conscience today. We have a knowledge of good and evil, and we're responsible individually before God for what we know. And the age of human government, of course, hasn't ended either. We're still in that time, but things have been added to it. More has happened since then. And life for us today is very different from how it was for people right after the flood and up to the time of Abraham, and even in Gentile nations during the time of Abraham and the nation of Israel. And we'll look at that next week.